a field exercise that's going on in Jordan that might be like a descriptor, help us understand some of the international things you're doing?
Absolutely. So there's an international treaty called the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And what that treaty describes is the way in which we would verify that a country has performed a nuclear test. So it is our goal as a world body not to have countries perform nuclear tests so that we can prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we sent a group of scientists from Pacific Northwest National Lab all the way to Jordan, and they were exercising new technology. So under this treaty, a country can claim that another country has performed a nuclear test. And so it would be the job of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization to then go into that country and verify whether that test had occurred or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so this group of scientists and engineers was bringing new technology, some of which was developed at PNL to help verify a treaty like that.
And what did they discover? I'm curious.
You know, it was a trial run. The CTBT has not yet gone into force. And so what they're working through is what are all the procedures and protocols that we would use if the treaty were actually in force.
Okay.
And so a group like the International Atomic Energy Agency would be implementing that treaty, and that's obviously something that's been in the news lately in the context of the Iranian negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Our phone number is 547-8726 if you have a question for the next hour or even want to make a comment. So would some of the technology that you have developed here ultimately be used in keeping track of what Iran is doing?
Yes, potentially. So our role at PNL is to do the science and develop the sensors that could be deployed in a regime like that. There are two technologies I can give as examples. One is in this particular agreement we have with Iran, there's a requirement that we do online monitoring of the uranium gas that's used in centrifuge that is then enriched. And some of the technology that's coming out of PNL in our collaboration with Oak Ridge National Laboratory is developing the sensor that could actually measure that enrichment in real time. And that's not something that has ever been deployed before. Another example is that Iran will be required to export all of their spent fuel from the country. That's this fuel coming out of a reactor that contains plutonium that could be used in nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And so we're developing some of the technology that you could scan that fuel and build a 3D image like you get at a CAT scan when you go to the hospital, try to understand and ensure that that fuel is in the same condition when it leaves the country as when it left the reactor, for example. So I think it's that tie between those real-world problems that you hear about on the radio and the passion for the underlying science that really drives a lot of people to come to PNL.
Absolutely. So I'm thinking that your recruiting is nationwide and even worldwide, isn't it?
Absolutely. We hire staff from around the country. I'm, as you mentioned, a transplanted East Coaster. We do have, in some of our fundamental science programs, absolutely people coming from around the world. One of the things that really excites staff is to be out there with an international presence, and we have folks that are collaborating with scientists across the world. For example, on nuclear forensics, where we want to train other countries that may not have the same expertise we have to go in, and if they did seize nuclear material at their borders, well, how would they do that? What is the law enforcement protocol you would use, and how would you use the systems in the field to detect that nuclear material in the first place?
Wow, those are big topics. What was your role in, was Battelle or PNL involved in anything with Chernobyl?
We have supported Chernobyl. I'm not an expert in our support of Chernobyl. That really actually falls in our Energy and Environment Director.
Okay. What about Fukushima?
Fukushima, we did provide a background role for some of our national security work. So Department of Energy has emergency response teams that are prepared to go out into the field in the event of nuclear contamination here or nuclear terrorist attack, for example. And so we were involved in supporting the group that went to Japan and actually mapped out the area in Japan where people should be going based on the contamination and where they should be staying out of. And so we would, for example, develop some of the sensors that might be deployed on airborne systems to help detect that radiation.
Mm-hmm. What about border crossing? You just barely mentioned that a few moments ago, but people moving materials via borders. First of all, that seems like incredibly dangerous. That people would be doing that, but of course people are doing all kinds of crazy things. How does PNL involved in that, in training or detecting?
Yeah, so there's really two elements to that. First is we want to prevent our adversaries from getting access to nuclear material and the nuclear technology behind it. So we support something called export control, which is for those countries that have sensitive technology, we want to make sure that technology remains in that country, is not exported to a third party that shouldn't have access to it. So there's interdictions that happen at borders that we support our foreign partner countries to enable them to make those interdictions. Then there's actually detecting the nuclear material itself. So we have a strong presence in what we call radiation portal monitoring. And what this is we build sensors that you would put at a border crossing to detect nuclear material. If you have gone to Canada or Mexico and you've driven back into our country, you've probably gone through a portal monitor. And some of the algorithms that are in place in those portal monitors, P&L has supported and helped optimize to detect as small a quantities of nuclear material as we possibly can.
Well, who are those partner countries?
You know, those partner countries are really all over the world. There's a lot, in the past, a lot of attention has been surrounding the former Soviet Union. There are all sorts of countries that we probably can't spell, like Slovakia and Kazakhstan. But those are some hairy places where we send people to help train and build up the capacity in our partner countries, because a lot of those countries don't have a nuclear enterprise like we do. So they don't have the expertise, and they need our assistance. So it's in our national security interest to help them build that infrastructure and provide the training and the expertise that they need so that they can do their own operations, their own law enforcement, their own border security.
Are there other countries of the world that are doing what we're doing? I mean, I'm just thinking about France. I mean, obviously they're getting a lot of energy from the use of nuclear. Are they participating? Do they help in this at all?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the International Atomic Energy Agency is supported by a large group of countries, and they can reach back to whoever they want as part of a support program. And so, absolutely, some of the countries in Europe are partners that we work with regularly.
So you're not doing the diplomacy or any of that, basically. The Department of Energy or the U.S. government is describing to you what you'll be doing.
That's right.
So,
they set the policy priorities, and they define what the mission is. And then our job is to bring the science and technology to help support that. And so we try to inform them on what we call the art of the possible. You know, what are those things we can accomplish, or what are those things that are not feasible? And that informs them as they develop the policy. But you're absolutely right. We do not ourselves influence or make that policy.
I see, but you are giving them advice. Okay.
That's
Yes.
right. We're providing them the scientific basis behind whatever mission problem they're trying to solve. Yes.
All right, so tell us more about the Test Ban Treaty, and when will it be implemented then?
That's a good question. That touches on your previous question. That's up to the policymakers. What we do is build the sensors that would go behind and enable that treaty to come into place. So, for example, if you were to perform a nuclear test, there is a radioactive xenon that is released. And so PNL really pioneered the capability to measure extremely infinitesimal amounts of that xenon gas. So that it would be very difficult, for example, anywhere in the world to perform a nuclear test and not get caught. So there's a worldwide network of sensors called the International Monitoring System, and that system is strategically placed around the globe so that if someone were to try to sneak around this particular treaty, we believe we can catch them.
That's interesting. Wow. All right. So what about some, are you using any of this technology that is created for government purpose for other kinds of purposes, like commercial purposes or even energy production purposes?
In some cases that's true. Most of the time what we try to do is develop the technology and then we hand it off to the commercial sector for implementation. So for example, some of the millimeter wave scanning that you might have gone through at the airport when you pick up your arms and hold your elbows up and your hands high above your head, that technology actually came out of PNL. The basis for that was developed here, and then we transitioned that, and now that's being used in the field. And that's the sort of impact that gives people passion for their work. But the actual building of those systems on the mass scale, that's something we rely on our partners in the commercial sector to do.
All right. Hey, well, we're going to take a break here, but we want to be back, and we're going to talk a little bit about also how PNL came about and some of the Hanford heritage that still lingers there. So stick around. We are talking with some scientist managers from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. We're back in a moment. Welcome back to Meet in the Middle. I'm Christine Brown. My guest right now is Bob Runkle. He is basically a national security specialist. That's what I would call you, Bob. What's a better name for your position at PNL?
I'm actually the Nuclear Security Portfolio Manager, so I look over all of our work related to nuclear security.
Well, that nuclear security, but just national security, how much money are we talking about budget-wise at PNL?
The total lab budget is approximately $1 billion, and national security is half that, about $500 million.
Is that a 2-year cycle or a 1-year cycle?
That's a 1-year cycle.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's
okay.
an annual figure.
Yeah, so that's a lot of money being pumped into the Tri-Cities economy because you're paying staff, of course.
It
How
is.
many staff out there? 5,000, 4,500?
It's
What?
about 4,300 staff currently.
Okay.
Yep. And I think it's important to point out that we compete for that funding. We have other national laboratories that we compete against, as well as in some cases there are other federally funded research and development centers. And so that isn't something that we just get every year. We have to put our best and brightest in writing proposals and competing for that work.
Yes. I think that there's a lot of work that goes into that, and making sure that there is at least a level that maintains employment. I think that would be very difficult for people not to know. Well, that's been the life of Hanford, I guess, for people who have worked out there, anything associated with that. You never really know what 2 years from now is going to bring if you're going to have to, sell your home and move.
You make a good point. My counter to that would be that by forcing competition, we have an entrepreneurial spirit. So people really are passionate about defining their future, and they really control that destiny to the extent that they can get funding for the work that they want to do.
Yeah.
And that gives you a lot of freedom in your career, which is something I appreciate about working at PNNL.
So PNNL started doing a significant amount of work that was Hanford related.
That's
What's
right.
that heritage?
So we really grew out of the plutonium production mission that used to be going on the Hanford site. And that morphed into a lot of the environmental remediation that we do in our Energy and Environment Directorate. But now that's a small fraction lab, about 4% of the total work of the lab is related to Hanford.
4%? That is very, very small, isn't it?
It is, and I wasn't here in the early 90s, but that's a sea change from the work that we used to do. And I think that speaks to the agile nature of the folks at PNNL and really that entrepreneurial spirit.
Mm-hmm. Here's our phone number again. If anybody wants to call, you've got a question, you want to make a comment, that number is 547-8726. My guest right now is Bob Runkle with PNNL. What about cybersecurity? That seems to be a topic that concerns people when we constantly have all these different governments looking at each other.
Well, clearly a hot topic these days,
Yes.
Cybersecurity. So, one of the things we're trying to do at PNL and National Security Directorate is do the technology basis for what is the next generation way we look at cybersecurity. Today we're trying to protect individual computers, for example, with firewalls. Well, are there ways in which we can build a system where the information is constantly moving around so that our adversaries who are trying to get at that information don't even know where that information is? So it's that sort of reaching back into the basic science, if you will, or basic engineering in this case, that we're trying to apply to those mission problems that are real world. I mean, that's, for example, something that you could read about or hear about on the radio pretty much any day of the week.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to talk a little bit about, well, when you mentioned before fundamental science pursuit and dark matter, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote that down as a note, but man, start over again. What are you involved there?
Absolutely. So PNNL has an emerging presence in some of the fundamental physics work, and a lot of that is trying to really understand our universe on the mass scale. And dark matter is a term coined for matter that we really don't understand yet. So most of the matter in the universe is made of elements like you and I are made of, and the Earth around us. But it appears from looking at other galaxies that actually most of the matter in the universe is not made out of the matter that we're used to. And we call that dark matter, and it's really a euphemism for matter that we don't yet understand. And the reason that's important to PNNL is not only is it fascinating science of it in itself, but the sorts of technology we'd use, the sorts of systems we would develop to detect that dark matter are the same sort of technology we could then apply to things like the International Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that we talked about earlier. And so it's bringing that science all the way to the mission impact. We want to do that whole span of technology development.
Mm-hmm. Are you looking forward and beyond the basic detection of nuclear materials? What is the next step after that in terms of security?
That's a great question. There's a whole weaving together of the latest technology with the latest policy and the changing world dynamic. If you look at where we were a few years ago, we had strong cooperation with Russia, and people were talking about how could Russia and the United States collectively reduce their nuclear weapons stockpile down to very small numbers. Well, given the geopolitical dynamic, the world has changed dramatically. So we constantly have to be looking at what is on the 5-year horizon and what is the science that's going to be needed on that horizon. And that's not an easy question to answer. That requires getting a diverse set of capabilities together and applying them to a particular mission.
Mm-hmm. Who is our best friend out there from your perspective in terms of the work that you're doing? The best friend to the United States?
The best friend to the United States? I wouldn't point to any one particular friend that's our best friend. We certainly have a lot of partnerships with folks in Europe. The UK is a place that we work cooperatively a lot with, but I wouldn't put any one country above the rest.
You wouldn't?
No.
That's very diplomatic of you. Okay, all right. Have you met people who have become your friends by meeting them internationally with the work that you're doing?
In some cases, we, for example, I participated in an exercise where we brought in a group of law enforcement officers from different countries, and we brought them to PNL, and we helped train them, and they posed scientific scenarios to us where we would try to detect nuclear material, and we posed some back, and we tried to find the vulnerabilities in the way each of our thought processes work. So some of those folks are people you develop a relationship with.
Mm-hmm. All right, buildings. What about buildings? I know that not just buildings to withstand something that has to do with national security, but I guess how buildings can be better constructed.
Yeah, so that's an active area that the Department of Homeland Security is looking into. We call it critical infrastructure protection. And that spans everything from how do we know that our power plants are safe, for example, from cyber attacks that you were mentioning moments ago, all the way to how do you build resiliency? How would you make a city more resilient to whether that be a natural disaster like a flood, or whether that be a terrorist attack, for example. So that's a challenge of what is the infrastructure, and how do you build that infrastructure over time to make it more resilient? And that's one of the grand challenges that I would say exists in the Homeland Security realm. Mm-hmm. Because I think we all recognize that we can't be perfectly safe. So the question is how quickly can we bounce back? How can we make ourselves the most resilient as possible?
Well, as we've seen other natural disasters or even war in other parts of the world, yes, that is kind of a scary idea. We don't see that many of those situations here in the United States. Can you give us any examples of what you have come up with so far in terms of creating a stronger infrastructure?
Sure. Well, I'll give you one example, which comes out of Superstorm Sandy when it hit the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So there's a legislation that says every container coming to the country needs to be scanned for nuclear material. And so PNL has led the deployment of some of those systems to help scan those containers. And so when the port of New York, New Jersey was taken down during Superstorm Sandy, they couldn't resume operations until all of their radiation portal monitors, as they're called, were stood up and operational. And so we really amassed an army of staff here that collected the instruments, got them to the port, and actually installed those instruments before the port was actually running. And that was a great concern, actually. They were concerned that they would be waiting on these instruments before they could reopen their port. And as you can imagine, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey is a very busy place.
So that would be a prime opportunity for people to bring materials in that we would not want in if they looked at our infrastructure and said, oh, that's down right now, there's an opening.
That's exactly right. We try to make sure that those obvious vulnerabilities like you're articulating here are the ones we tackle first. So a lot of times when we're looking at an architecture and trying to deploy systems against our adversary, for example, in this case of nuclear trafficking, we try to figure out what are the highest risk routes, what are those pathways that they would take that are the most risky, and let's tackle those first.
All right. Wow, there's so much research going on out there, and the things that you have mentioned today, those are all active projects, or could those be some from the past?
Most of those are active projects. I mean, Superstorm Sandy is past us, but we're always trying to develop what is that next generation, because in most cases the security mission is secondary to commerce, for example, and we need to make sure that we interfere with that commercial driver to the least extent possible. And we're always trying to refine that art.
Fascinating work. All right, we're going to take a break here, and then we'll be back with our second scientist manager and learn more about energy kinds of research that is being done at PNNL. Our phone number, 547-8726. We're back in a moment.